Hello, good morning, and welcome to Tuesday's Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about British politics in under 20 minutes.
It's Tuesday the 26th of November, which means, Sam, there is less than a month to go until Christmas. I assume you've already done all your Christmas shopping. I certainly haven't. My name is Jack Blanchard, Politico. With me, you can hear Sam Coates of Sky News. How are you, Sam? Happy Tuesday.
Very good indeed, not least because last night we found out that our podcast has made the global top 30 best podcasts of 2024. So nestling alongside the rest is entertainment, the Joe Rogan Experience, Donald Trump yet to be a guest on our podcast, it has to be said, and every type of agents podcast is politics and Jack and Sam's, which is excellent. So welcome to the 6:30 a.m. club. It's very nice to have you all. I've lit a single log fire behind me in celebration. You could just about see it, I think, if I tilt the camera down.
Wow,
there.
You really have got a flame burning for this prestigious moment. Sam Coates gets very excited about being on this like this, so thank you for whoever has done that. It keeps him happy, gets him through the day. Lots going on today. We should just briefly say the biggest story that might be happening today is actually in the Middle East. We won't really get into that on this podcast this morning. It's not really a UK story, but the Israeli cabinet is meeting today to discuss a possible peace plan with Lebanon. The US officials are briefing frantically that they think this might actually be a moment where we see a 60-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. That would obviously be a huge deal if indeed it happens, although we've heard this sort of thing from US officials many times before, Sam, over the past year or so, and it hasn't come to fruition. Nevertheless, there seems to be lots of optimism that Israel is in a position to actually do this time. So we'll see how that pans out.
The main thing today, however, that the government wants us to talk about, and we're happy to talk about because there's a lot to get into, is their blueprint, such as it is, for welfare reform. This is the government's first stab at trying to overhaul the benefit system and the sort of worklessness problem that this country has. I think this is the biggest, most chewy problem that this government has got to face. It is an enormous issue right now. 9.2 million people are economically inactive. That's almost 900,000 more than before the pandemic. 2.8 million people are off work, registered as long-term sick. And that puts Britain as an outlier for not really having tailed off significantly since the pandemic ended. And this is a big, big problem. And before we get into the details of what Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, is proposing today alongside Keir Starmer, who is owning a lot of this, I just want to explain why this matters quite so much. In a funny way, the big events of this week are all tied together. Rachel Reeves at the CBI conference yesterday and this worklessness overhaul. And that's because Rachel Reeves came under fire yesterday for the tax rises in the budget, which people like the chairman of the CBI basically said made it harder to employ people, made it harder to generate growth, made it harder to deliver the government's goals. While she was at the CBI, Rachel Reeves responded to her critics by saying, look, I understand public services need to live within their means because I'm really clear I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes. In other words, there was an explicit recognition that she'd maxed out the credit card when it comes to those two ways of raising money or saving money. And effectively, she said, you know, I'm done with those two things. However, at the same time, in answer to a question from one of my Sky colleagues, or whether or not this effectively meant that there'd be cuts in future years, post-2026, to Whitehall budgets, she said, well, we don't know that yet. We've got to wait and see. And that, Jack, I think, is because the Treasury is looking very, very hard at this absolutely ballooning welfare budget and asking whether or not that can't be the place where further savings are found. Keir Starmer's rhetoric has been eye-wateringly tough on this. I mean, we referred yesterday to the Mail on Sunday article, which talked about him raising money, working on farms and the like when he was a kid. And he gives off all the impression of somebody who understands the need to get people back into work, possibly by some quite tough measures. Today, we've got the soft stuff, we've got the carrot, but none of the stick. I believe that the battle over the kind of harder end, benefit sanctions and tough stuff is going to be the battle inside government over the next year, because the Treasury needs some of those savings in order to stop there being reductions on public services in the second half of the Parliament, and need those savings in order to effectively ensure that they get the growth and that they want. So I think that the measures that we are starting to talk about today, but there's a big hole in the middle of them, and we'll come onto that in a moment, sets us up for a battle basically between the Treasury and the rest of the Labour Party over just how tough and hard this government ought to be on welfare claimants. And as difficult decisions are having to be made in next year's spending review, you're going to have the Treasury pointing to the welfare bill and going, we can soften these curbs on public spending if we can go further, getting people back into work. That is going to be, I think that sets us up for one of the big dramas of the next 3 years.
There's an awful lot to get into here, starting with a Chancellor standing up 6 months into her tenure and saying, I'm not coming back with more borrowing and more taxes, is a pretty bold thing for a Chancellor to be saying. You do not know what is going to happen over the next few years. We're old enough to remember the Tories promising in 2019 they wouldn't be putting up national insurance, Sam, and then we got a pandemic, and then Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, was suddenly putting up national insurance. You can't go making sweeping promises like that and just expect them to people to believe you. Rachel Reeves has already got a credibility problem given the promises she said before the general election about borrowing and taxes, which have proven to be bent way out of all recognition within a few months of coming in. Whether anyone's going to believe this promise remains to be seen.
Wasn't it just a careless slip, yet another careless slip by her? She should have said, I'm not going to do any big rises in taxes or borrowing, because there's no way she, as you say, she can rule it out. She has created a really unnecessary stick for which people will beat her with in future budgets.
Like I say, you just don't know how it's going to pan out. You can't predict the future. The world is extremely uncertain, etc., etc. Set aside from that, though, of course, you're completely right. She clearly doesn't want to come back with more plans for borrowing and taxes, whether or not she does. And therefore, you're completely right. This ballooning welfare bill, I mean, any government of any colour would feel that it needed to do something about this. I think it's fair to say, given what has happened to health and disability benefits since the COVID pandemic. Liz Kendall's the Work and Pension Secretary. She gave a speech back in July, soon after the election, saying that this moment was coming, that there was going to be a big white paper on getting people back into work. Liz Kendall, seen as one of the more right-wing members, frankly, of the Parliamentary Labour Party, was given this job as Work and Pension Secretary specifically to take on this challenge. There's going to be a cabinet meeting this morning, Tuesday morning. Then we'll see Liz Kendall in the House of Commons at lunchtime. At around that time, this white paper is going to be released. We're expecting it to be a 70-odd page document. The problem is, Sam, how much are we going to see today in terms of specifics? The answer is not a great deal, it would seem. As you say, there's lots of the sort of, I don't want to call it the cuddly end of the spectrum. That's a bit silly, but there's things about changing the way job centres work, changing the way that we help young people get into work. Lots of things that are definitely really important. But as you say, in the end, there's going to have to be something harsher for people who are seen as not engaging in work or whatever. And we've seen this from so many governments before. I mean, how many prime ministers have stood up and said that they are going to take on what they call variously benefit offenders, benefit scroungers, in the words of Peter Lilly back in the day. You remember that from the 1990s when he was Work and Pension Secretary. George Osborne went at this again and again and again with huge criticism from the Labour Party. Ian Duncan Smith and his universal credit. We've had many attempts to reform Britain's benefits system, many of which were absolutely despised by Labour MPs, and yet here we are in 2024 still having similar conversations. And if Keir Starmer and Liz Kendall are serious about bringing this bill down, and they clearly are serious about doing it, then the sorts of measures they may have to take are going to be deeply upsetting to lots of Labour MPs, just like all those Tory ones were when the Tories were in power. Now, Keir Starmer has the parliamentary majority to get through whatever he wants, but the noise and upset that it is likely to cause within the Parliamentary Labour Party is going to be significant. And it feels like today they're punting that battle for another day, maybe in some point next year, but it is coming and it is going to be messy.
The reason it's so tricky is over 1 in 3 of the new disability benefit awards that are given out are basically for mental health problems. That's quite a big jump. So it's jumped from 28% pre-COVID to 37% now. And tackling the issue of people who are not working for mental health issues is one of the most sensitive and tricky things that any government, but particularly a Labour government, will find itself doing. But you know, we are just coming up against hard realities. That another hard reality is that there isn't a great deal of research and knowledge as to exactly why that is. So there are a million reasons to delay, as the government seems to have done, as we sort of hinted at yesterday, any tougher measures to deal with the ballooning sickness benefit bill, right? But by delaying it, you are creating a problem of delaying when any savings might come in, or not even savings. You just need to curb the expansion of the bill, because at the moment the projections are incredible. And over the course of this decade, some bits of the welfare bill are just doubling. And the Treasury cannot afford for that to happen. We as a country cannot really afford for that to happen, which is why it will end up being Rachel Reeves and Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, just leaning on Liz Kendall. And I have been struck all the way along that Liz Kendall has been incredibly reluctant to talk about the issue of sanctions, even though she's one of the most new Labour members of Keir Starmer's cabinet. Even she has shied away from it and preferred to talk about, for instance, bringing together health professionals into job centres, or to look at pilots, or as they're doing today, handing more money to mayors in order to give local councils and local authorities greater scope to try and match up skills funding and skills programmes with worklessness. All of that working together will get you so far, but only so far. And she has been notable not wanting to go at this stage much further than that. But with Darren Jones and Rachel Reeves breathing down her neck, it seems like she's not going to be able to avoid that.
One example of that we heard over the weekend, because some of this was trailed, of course, into the Sunday papers, and Liz Kendall was out and about doing broadcast on Sunday, that there's a particular focus on young people under 22s, or people aged under 22 will have to accept work, educational training to stop them slipping out of the labour market, or something will happen to them, but we're not exactly clear on what that is. I mean, sanctions already exist within the system. You know, the Tories, when they were in power in the 2010s, ratcheted up the sanction systems quite a lot. Labour protested endlessly about that. You might think that's right or wrong, but nevertheless, that system already exists. Are we going to see a further ratcheting up of that? We don't know, because none of that appears to be in the white paper today. There'll be a review next year, and that is something that is coming further down the track. Some of this will be played out in the Commons today, Sam, in the debate, but you suspect that quite a lot of Labour MPs will be sitting quietly through this one, not wanting to wade in, waiting for the grisly details when they come before they finally make their positions clear.
And business isn't helping. You saw Rupert Soames, the chairman of the CBI, basically saying we've just had a budget which makes employing people, particularly the young, particularly part-time and low-paid, much more expensive. There is also a backlash from business over the Employment Rights Bill. A different government committee has given it a basically red rating, a negative rating. It's called the Regulatory Policy Committee. And it's basically said that bill, which is going through at the moment, which gives employers more rights, is not the impact assessment, which works out the kind of the hit the business will take and the benefits that bill gives, is not fit for purpose. And interestingly, the government was quite emollient at that decision by the Regulatory Policy Committee, saying that they're going to refine their analysis and produce further assessments as the bill progresses through Parliament, working with experts and businesses. And I just saw that quote from government, and I wondered if that was a sign that maybe the business department were listening to some of the criticism and prepared to shift and mould some of the things in that quite contentious bill that we've talked about before.
I just want to talk about a couple of other things the government are doing today, Sam, that are interesting beyond welfare. One is notice that the tobacco and vapes bill is in the Commons today. There's very little furore about this, but this is actually a massive deal. This is the government introducing Rishi Sunak's policy of banning the sale of tobacco to all young people forevermore. It's a massive seismic change that has been rather relegated down the news agenda today, I guess, because we spent quite a lot of the year talking about it when it was Rishi Sunak's policy. But nevertheless, we'll see Labour MPs pushing it through today. That is a big moment. Also, interestingly, Business Secretary Johnny Reynolds is up before the Business Select Committee this afternoon. We have it in Playbook this morning that at a dinner tonight, he is going to announce that the UK's zero emissions vehicles mandate is going to be up for consultation. This is a really big deal. This is the commitment that the previous government have made, setting targets for all car manufacturers to introduce more and more electric vehicles and electric van sales into their overall sales. If they miss those targets, they start getting clobbered with big fines. The manufacturing industry has been up in arms about this for weeks. There was a big meeting last week with business department officials where they made their position loud and clear, and it seems, I don't want to say the government's bowing to the car manufacturing lobby, but nevertheless, they are agreeing to review the whole thing. There's going to be a quick consultation, and it appears the zero emissions vehicle mandate is going to change. That is a pretty big deal, but again, is part of what the government would say is about putting growth first, possibly at the expense of the environment, and that is an interesting dynamic that this government is having to grapple with, and will continue to have to grapple with throughout the whole of the 2020s as it pushes forward with growth, but also pushes forward to trying to hit its very, very taxing green targets that it's committed to. And we're just seeing an inkling today, I think, of how it's trying to redress that balance a little bit. It's pretty clear which side's won this one.
That's really fascinating. You'll remember it was about a year ago that Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister, downgraded some green commitments, most notably the ban on sale of petrol and diesel cars, new cars, from 2030 to 2035 to much squealing. At that point, Rishi Sunak himself didn't feel like he could scrap those targets that you've just referred to, because that would go too far, the targets that do put what car manufacturers would call quite onerous burdens by forcing them to sell that proportion of cars as electric cars, or face fines. So if Labour are going to go further, just weeks after they signed up to those eye-wateringly ambitious 81% reduction on 1990 levels of emissions by 2035, that's quite something, and it does leave you wondering quite how they're going to square the circle of all of the emissions targets that they make with the reality of kind of near-term pressures from business on growth.
It's worth saying that Labour are still very much saying they will stick to their overall target of phasing out new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, which is quicker than Rishi Sunak was going to do it. The question is, how do you get there? And if you take out these sorts of targets, is it even a realistic target at all? That's the debate that is going on in the industry at the moment. One other thing to say on Johnny Reynolds, who's also not only the Business Secretary, the Business and Trade Secretary. Overnight, Sam, Donald Trump taking to his Truth social media platform to announce that he says he will levy tariffs of 25% on all imports from Canada and Mexico at the start of his tenure next year, and an extra 10% tariff on Chinese goods coming into the US. This appears to be the first proper detail of what Donald Trump is actually planning to do in terms of tariffs when he becomes president in less than 2 months' time now. He did not mention Britain in this announcement, but which will be a sigh of relief for Johnny Reynolds. But nevertheless, it's an indication. I don't think this is going to be the end of it. It's an indication of where his head is at. And I think it'll be worth watching Johnny Reynolds discussing this as well, because we know that the UK has been making preparations quietly for what it might do if Trump goes ahead with what he's threatening to do in terms of tariffs on all, European goods as well and UK goods as well. We understand, we've got it in Playbook today, that Britain does have a set of retaliatory tariffs ready to go if it wants to use them. The ones that we used when we were still part of the EU system last time Trump was in power, which involved tariffs on imported US goods such as Jack Daniels, whiskey and Harley Davidson motorbikes and so on. That set of tariffs is ready to go. It does not require further clearance from the watchdog as new tariffs normally would. And so there is a sort of plan. It doesn't mean that we're going to use it, but there is a plan ready to go, waiting in the Department of Business and Trade if we need it.
The overall tone of this government seems to be quite softly when it comes to Donald Trump. So let's see whether Keir Starmer ultimately is prepared to push that big red button. But that's fascinating that they're in the in tray, all ready to go. That's 20 minutes, and I'll see you again tomorrow morning.
All right. We'll look forward to you burning another log fire then. See you then, Sam. Bye-bye.
Cheers.